The Alter Rebbe's unique script for safrus has a rich and winding history. It has been inked, shelved, revived, and debated, and everyone seems to have an opinion. So what is the story behind this ksav? What sets it apart? Why do some embrace it wholeheartedly, while others remain unsure? This class explores its historical trajectory, some of the writing nuances, and the ongoing conversation around its adoption. Links to the relevant images can be found in the description. There's a tshuva from the Tzemach Tzedek, Simin Yudalid, in Chelik Oirach Chaim. This tshuva is dated to Chav Zayin Sivan Tov Kuf Pei Zayin. To be more exact, that's when the questioner posed this question. So that's in the spring-summer of 1827. This individual asks of the Tzemach Tzedek the following question. He says, "Hatfilin shali my tefillin, shehema ksav yad hasofer." They're from the handwritten work of the sofer, who's a sofer mumcha, the professional sofer, Reb Reuven Yanovich. Yanovich is a town in White Russia. And Reb Reuven is the sofer, and Nasati leboitkam, and he made my tefillin, but I gave them to check to another sofer, lechem esofer de sivaseinu. And he goes on to describe the problem in the tshuva, the questioner. What's the problem? The problem is there's a shaila on the klaf. In order for the klaf to be prepared properly for tefillin, it needs to be prepared in a very special way. We're not going to get into the specifics. And here there was a shaila whether this was done appropriately. And so this other sofer, the checker, said, "I don't know if this is really good," and he was almost ready to passel the tefillin. However, there's a caveat. Now, the checking sofer was very hesitant to cast aspersions on the original sofer. This Reb Reuven is a sofer mumcha, and clearly you can tell from this tshuva he has a reputation. And the checking sofer was very hesitant whether it was appropriate for him to call into question, which is why this turns into a shaila that comes to the Tzemach Tzedek. Now all of this is in the language of the questioner. The questioner signs his name at the end of the tshuva. He says his name is Rabbi Yisachar Ber of Ratshov. Now the Tzemach Tzedek, when he wrote his tshuva, rephrased the question in his own words. So let's see how the Tzemach Tzedek rephrased the question. She'ela, hatfilin shali, my tefillin, ksav yad hasofer hamumcha, from the professional sofer, shel admar rabbeinu, hagadol mereinu harav Reb Shneir Zalman, nishmas eden Reb Reuven Miyanovich. The Tzemach Tzedek does here something very noteworthy. He doesn't just describe Reb Reuven as a professional sofer, he describes and labels this Reb Reuven Miyanovich as the sofer of the Alter Rebbe. And so suddenly we realize the stock of this Reb Sofer goes way up, and we realize we're talking about a very special individual if someone merits to be the Sofer of the Alter Rebbe. Now the truth is, throughout the generations, there were many Gdolei Yisrael that had one Sofer they relied on. They were very happy with this one Sofer, and so they had it, and one could imagine and could think that that's what's happening over here, that like many other Gdolei Yisrael, the Alter Rebbe has a sofer that he relies on. Who's this? Reb Reuven of Yanovich. But as it becomes apparent, we realize that to be the Alter Rebbe sofer means much more, and that's because the Alter Rebbe is a major player when it comes to the world of safrus. Where do we see this? The first place we see this is in the Shulchan Aruch, Siman Lamed Vav, Eirach Chaim. Let's read Sif Aleph, where the Alter Rebbe says the following. He establishes the rule that he says, Lechatchila, it is preferred to write a ksiva tama ushlema. One needs to write a complete writing in a way, shalamdua midivrei ha-Talmud u'midrashim ve'kabbalah me'rishonim. People, the writing should be consistent with what we have in the Gemara, in Midrashim, and from the Rishonim. So that's lechatchila. However, b'diavad imshina loy pasal elan kain hifsitzuras ois lagamri. If one didn't mamish follow every rule and regulation from these earlier sources, it doesn't disqualify the tefillin, the mezuzah, the stam, unless he undermined the ois entirely. So that's Alter Rebbe's introduction to the siman. Obviously, there's so much detail to that one halacha, which we're not going to get into. But then, what he does is, he then goes into Sif Beis. And he says in Sif Beis, Zu tmunas oisias. And the Alter Rebbe starts giving us a list of the Aleph and the Beis and the Gimel and the Dalid and the Hey and the Vav, all of the letters. He goes one by one, and he starts telling us how these are supposed to be written. And one of the things, even a cursory review of this siman, we see many mentions to Soid and the Arizal. In the letter Beis, he mentions Al Pi Soid twice and Al Pi Kabbalas Arizal once. That's in the letter Aleph. And the letter Beis, he mentions Al Pi Soid, and then later he mentions Al Pi Kabbalah. In the letter Gimel, he mentions Kabbalas Arizal. In the letter Vav, he mentions Al Pi Soid and Al Pi Kabbalas Arizal, and on and on and on. This is very noteworthy because it's very different from the average siman in Shulchan Aruch. The average siman in Shulchan Aruch, the Alter Rebbe will call, is very conservative. Conservative in the sense that he's following the Shulchan Aruch, the Mechaber, the Ramah, and the Gdolei Achronim that lived in the 17th century, most notably the Magen Avraham, and he's quoting from them. Usually when the Alter Rebbe and the Shulchan Aruch quotes from the Arizal, it's because the Magen Avraham quoted the Arizal, the Shara Kavanis, or whatever it is. But this is very, very different. The Alter Rebbe over here is giving us the rules and regulations for the writing of Stam, but he's relying very heavily on Kabbalah, much more than he does in the typical Sif of Shulchan Aruch, Siman in Shulchan Aruch, which means that if someone is going to be the Sofer of the Alter Rebbe, even before we continue, this means obviously that they're going to be an expert in implementing all of these rules that the Alter Rebbe is going to articulate here in this Siman, in Siman Lamed Vav of Shulchan Aruch. However, as it's going to become apparent, in fact, to be the Alter Rebbe Sofer, even this would not be enough, as is going to become clear from the next tshuva of the Tzemach Tzedek that we're going to look at. This is Siman Yud Ches. Siman Yud Ches, someone writes to the Tzemach Tzedek the following shaila. This one we could date to the 1820s as well. How that is the case, I'll show you soon. Someone writes to the Tzemach Tzedek, Ra'oi ra'isi bekama sifrei Torah v'tefillin u'mezuzas. I've seen in various stam sha'akofim pshutin that what we call the langechof einam angulos, aren't rounded. So what does this mean when he says they aren't rounded? So if you look here on the screen, you'll see that this langechof, the top right, it's rounded, which is similar to the regular chaf, which is rounded at the top. The person who's writing this question is saying that he sees in Sifrei Torah and Tefillin and Mezuzas that the kofim pshutim, which means this langechaf over here, is not rounded at the top. This is a lashon of the shoyel, who's the sofer the kila. It's a sofer who's asking the shaila. He turns to the Tzemach Tzedek. He wants to know what should be the ruling in this case. Now the Tzemach Tzedek, when he's dealing with this, he quotes the following. He says that there was a great Rav and Mekubal whose name was Reb Moshe Galanti, and he says Shebetshuvas Maram Galanti. He says she'ein hechrech klal michaf kfufa lechaf pshuta shetzricha liyos agula davka. Maram Galanti says, I don't want you to carry over and say that just like a regular chaf needs to have a rounded top, I don't want you to assume that so too the lange chaf needs to have the rounded top. Why? Says Maram Galanti, Reb Moshe Galanti, the nun pshuto yoichiach. The nun is going to prove to us. And he goes on to say that the Maram Galanti says the way we do the nun is like this, the way it's depicted over here, where if you look at the vertical stem going up toward the top, the roof of the nun, it's very much all the way over to the right. There's not much of the roof spilling over to the right of the vertical. That's in the regular nun. However, Maram Galanti goes on to say that in the Langa nun, it's not that way. The vertical goes right up basically to the middle, and you have the roof spilling over to the right and the left. In other words, a zayin. In other words, a Langa nun is a zayin. Now a nun and a Langa nun are the same letter. And yet Maram Galanti says that we don't have that same reality. We don't have a zayin look. If anything, it looks more like a vav. What does that show us? There's separation in the family of letters between the regular and the langa it's not necessarily the case that what is in one has to be in the other. This is what Maram Galanti says. Continues the Tzemach Tzedek and says the truth is that if you learn the Beis Yosef has a lot of information in Simon Lamed Vav on the letters. This is what became known as the ksav Beis Yosef. The ksav Beis Yosef, basically, the Beis Yosef, Rabbi Yosef Karo collected a ton of information from the Rishonim of Ashkenaz of how the letters are supposed to look, and this became known as the ksav Beis Yosef that's used in the typical Ashkenazi script. The Beis Yosef writes that both should look like a Zayin. The Lange Nun needs to look like a Zayin where the roof spills over on both sides, and the regular Nun should also look like a Zayin where the roof spills over on both sides. So the Tzemach Tzedek is saying Maram Galanti versus the Beis Yosef. So who's right? Well, the Tzemach Tzedek wants to go in the direction to say Maram Galanti is right, because if you do that, then we don't have the chaf problem. Because then the fact that the regular chaf is rounded at the top and the Langer chaf is not rounded at the top, if you follow Moshe Galanti's theory, it's not a problem if there's a discrepancy between the two. But do we have the right to follow Maram Galanti if the Beis Yosef goes in the other direction? Says that Tzemach Tzedek, we do. Why? So he says, because Ochein bistam shalanu, in our safrus ro'isi, the Tzemach Tzedek says, I seen that the nun kfufa k'moshe kasuv Maram Galanti. I saw that the nun, what we call the regular nun, the nun kfufa, is actually the way Maram Galanti writes. That it's like this, not like this, not like the Beis Yosef. Sharei zayin roisha oiver mishnei tzadin, because a zayin, the head goes over on both sides. But our nun doesn't look like that. Our nun looks more like this. So the Tzemach Tzedek is looking at our stam, saying, obviously, it must be we paskin like Maram Galanti. You see where this is going. It's not going to be the end of the world if the regular chaf and the Langer chaf are different in terms of the rounded top. Okay. Now, here's the point. Here's the clincher. Let's open the Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch, Siman Lamed Vav, where he describes the letter Nun. Let's see how the Alter Rebbe tells us in the Siman the letter Nun should be written. Zakt Alter Rebbe, Yehei Roisha Kizayin. The Nun, the roof of the Nun should look like a Zayin, which means it should spill over to the right or the left. This is the Langer Nun. Why? The regular Nun. Lefisha Tzarech Li is Shavel Nun Pshuta, because it needs to be similar to the Nun Pshuta, the Langer Nun. So the regular Nun should look like this, the Alter Rebbe says, like a Zayin, because it needs to look like this. This is what the Alter Rebbe says here. We already know from the Tzemach Tzedek that he says Stam Shalanu does not reflect what the Alter Rebbe says over here. The Tzemach Tzedek saying that it looks more like this. So suddenly, and we're going to develop this point more, when we say someone is the Alter Rebbe's Sofer, presumably the Stam Shalanu, the Stam that the Tzemach Tzedek is using in the 1820s, a few years after the Alter Rebbe passed away, presumably Stam Shalanu is endorsed and approved by the Alter Rebbe. Which therefore means for someone to be the Sofer of the Alter Rebbe, Reb Reuven, it's not enough to have mastered this siman in the Shulchan Aruch, but he obviously has this expertise in what the Tzemach Tzedek is calling Stam Shalanu, in these traditions that obviously weren't written and incorporated into the Shulchan Aruch. This becomes more apparent in the same tshuva of the Tzemach Tzedek when he talks about the mem. The Alter Rebbe in his Shulchan Aruch says that the mem needs to be rounded at the top, regular mem needs to be rounded at the top right, and what we call a shlos mem needs to be rounded at the top. Sheyesh la'asoisa agula b'tzad yamin lechatchila, at the top, avoloy lamata, not at the bottom, but at the top. This is what it needs to be. This is what the Alter Rebbe says in Shulchan Aruch. Says the Tzemach Tzedek in the same tshuva, the same idea. We have in Stam Shalanu separation between the regular letter and the Sofit letter, the Shlos letter. He says over here, Lefi Tmunas Hamemin Bistam Shalanu, in our Stam, the Mem Psucha, the open mem, the regular mem, is Agula Lamaila, it's rounded over there. Litzad Yamin on the right side. But the Mem Stuma, the Shlos Mem Merubas, it is square, bizavis, it has on all four sides, it has corners. Alma, what does that prove? That Stam Shalanu is the Ein Medaktekin Lasais on Shavim Mamish. We don't necessarily insist that the regular letter needs to be consistent with the end letter. We showed it by the mem, and we showed it by the nun, and therefore the Tzemach Tzedek, as you can see, is leaning in this tshuva to say to this sofer, it's not the end of the world, that there's a discrepancy between the chaf and the lange chaf. However, before the Tzemach Tzedek issued his psak din, he did something very interesting. He sent a question to his uncle. His uncle is known as the Maharil, Yehuda Leib of Yanovich. This is the Alter Rebbe's younger brother, and he was alive at this time, and that's how we know how to date this Maisa, because the Maharil passed away in 1826, and so therefore we know that this tshuva, just like the other one, is from the 1820s. The Tzemach Tzedek writes as follows: Ledoidi Maharil, Bakashasi, I'm asking you, Yoidieni Daitoi, please tell me your opinion, Be'inyan Chaf Pshuta, about a lange chaf, She'ena Agula Lamaila Karesh, which doesn't have a rounded curve at the top. Shehechmir Kvoid Adoini Avis Keini Moidi Virabi Agoin. The Alter Rebbe was machmir in Shulchan Aruch, and without getting into the details, certain problems in safrus you could fix. The Alter Rebbe in Simon Lamed Vav was saying that if someone makes this mistake, where they don't have a rounded top to their lange chaf, ain't lo tikkun, you can't even fix it without getting into the reasons why. Let's just accept it. Says the Tzemach Tzedek, I actually think the Pri Megadim has a good argument where he says maybe it's okay, you add a little ink and maybe you fill it out at the top and you take what's and you're able to fix it up. Then he goes on to say, and maybe it's not so upgefrekt to say that this even works in the Alter Rebbe. Maybe we could even figure it out in the Alter Rebbe as well. So why am I asking you a shaila? Why am I asking, Ulai Shmiya Leibazeh Minei, maybe you heard something from the Alter Rebbe. Alter Rebbe had passed away, 10 years earlier or something like that. Maybe you heard something. So in other words, what is this confirming for us? There's a siman in Shulchan Aruch. But when it comes to shaila and stam, what's the Tzemach Tzedek doing? He's saying there is also an oral tradition from the Alter Rebbe. So because we know that there's an oral tradition from the Alter Rebbe, I'm asking you, the brother, whether you heard anything. But then look at the next thing he does. The Tzemach Tzedek now writes, Gam yimchil na, I'm asking your forgiveness. Lishol, for the tircha that I'm going to ask of you. Lishol pi ha-sofer hamuvik Reb Reuven neireyoyer ulai shmiya leminei. Please go ask Reb Reuven. Remember, where's Maharil living? In Yanovich. Where's Reb Reuven the Sofer live? He lives in Yanovich. So you live in the same town. I'm asking you, please do me a favor. Go to Reb Reuven and ask him. Maybe he heard something about how the Alter Rebbe paskined about the lange chaf. Again, what do you mean? What are you asking, Shad? Open the Shulchan Aruch and paskin out of the Shulchan Aruch. But the Tzemach Tzedek knows that there's an oral tradition, and it's not enough to go by the Shulchan Aruch because there's stam shalom. I already showed you in the Shulchan Aruch. I already showed you in terms of the nun and in terms of the mem. There's differences between what the Alter Rebbe says in the Shulchan Aruch and what the Tzemach Tzedek is calling stam shalanu. And along those lines, we see over here, he's asking the Alter Rebbe's brother. He's asking the Sofer Reb Reuven. The Maharil responded immediately with a tshuva to the Tzemach Tzedek, and he said, I don't understand how you could even think to teach the Alter Rebbe and Shulchan Aruch differently. Obviously, according to Alter Rebbe and the Shulchan Aruch, according to my brother in the Shulchan Aruch, you can't add any ink, it's a lost case. However, that's only about what Alter Rebbe said in Shulchan Aruch. But the Maharil is going to confirm this idea that the Shulchan Aruch is not the final word. Umekol makoim, he writes to the Tzemach Tzedek, B'yoy mochar im yirtzeh Hashem, eres moireinu harav Reb Reuven Sofer, v'eshma mimenu. I'm going to see him tomorrow. We're going out for breakfast or whatever it is, and I'm going to speak to him. And so here, this really gives you confirmation, and now we're really able to see what does it mean to be Reb Reuven. In the 1820s, you're not only talking about a Sofer Mumcha, who obviously was highly regarded, ad kadei kach, that another Sofer was very hesitant to even ask a question about his safrus, but he's much more than that. He's someone who has the oral tradition of the Alter Rebbe. He's the authority. There's other authorities too. The Maharil is also an authority, but he is the authority about the oral tradition of how we do what the Tzemach Tzedek is calling in the 1820s, Stam Shalom. There's another tshuva of the Tzemach Tzedek where the question was how to write the Shira in Parshas Beshalach, and at the conclusion of this tshuva in Siman Reish Zayin, the Tzemach Tzedek says, Ulamaisa If you want to know practically, tzivisi, I told him, lahatikla me ha-sefer Torah, copy from the sefer Torah, sheksav ha-sefer ha-mefursam, written by the famous Sofer Shel, the Alter Rebbe, harehu ha-sefer, Mereinu Reuven Zal. So by this time he had passed away, and just copy what he did and everything is going to be fine. This is important. In other words, what happens when Reb Reuven's not here? How are we going to do Stam Shalanu without the Reb Reuven? How are we going to continue this tradition? Well, for the Tzemach Tzedek, the answer is just look at what he did, and you're going to follow what he did, and that's how we are going to proceed. Ad Kan is a summary of the first part of tonight's shir, so let's just summarize what we saw. We've now established that by the 1820s, there's a unique ksav from the Alter Rebbe. It's mostly an oral tradition that is not necessarily consistent with what the Alter Rebbe has in Shulchan Aruch. The master of this tradition is Reb Reuven Sofer, who is, number one, a great expert. Number two, the Alter Rebbe used him. Number three, he heard directly from the Alter Rebbe. And number four, he's a very reliable Sofer. And this ksav is in wide use. How do we know it's in wide use? Because the Tzemach Tzedek in the Tshuva doesn't say in the ksav of Reb Reuven. He uses the much more general term, stam shalanu. In other words, all the stam that is shalanu, that is in our community, is this way. So in other words, by the 1820s, this is already not a one sofer phenomenon. This is a wide-ranging phenomenon that's widely in use. This is, Ad Kan is chapter number 1. And now we're going to fast forward from the 1820s and we're going to go way ahead to chapter number 2, which is about disruption. And that's going to bring us to the United States of America in the early 1940s. There is what to be said about the time in between, but we'll come to some of that later on. There's a letter from the Frierdiker Rebbe in Cheshvan of Tafshin Beis to Rabbi Menachem Ze'ev Greenglass in Montreal. And the Frierdiker Rebbe writes to him, I would like to see your handwriting in stam. And please let me know, do you write haksiva, do you write your ksav, bitmuna hamyuchedes lekvoy ktushas ad marzakin? Do you write in the ksav that is meyuchet to the Alter Rebbe, which we defined earlier? He also asks him, Imu yodei alasev diyotoiv, tell me if you know how to make good ink, among a few other stam-related questions that the Frierdiker Rebbe asks of Rabbi Greenglass. Apparently, Rabbi Greenglass responded that he does not know how to execute the ksav of the Alter Rebbe, because the Frierdiker Rebbe in a letter Chavtes Cheshvan Tafshin Beis writes them as follows. In response to your letter, Chaval, it is unfortunate, Shloi Nisragel B'ksiva Yafa, that you have not been used to writing in the nice handwriting B'tmunas Haksiva Shal Reb Reuven Sofer Nishmas Eiden. It's interesting. The Frierdiker Rebbe in the earlier letter phrased it as the ksav of the Alter Rebbe. Here he phrased it as the ksiva of Reb Reuven Sofer. Okay, we know that, we understand that they're pretty much synonymous. Okay, but still the shinoi lashon is interesting. Anyway, chaval that you didn't write it in the ksav of Reb Reuven Sofer, she ksiva yafe ad ma'od, which is a very nice ksav. Why? Why is this unfortunate? Ki b'medina zu nechutzim soferim. We need soferim here. And we need soferim in America, and we need the soferim to know the ksav of the Alter Rebbe. So it's chaval that you don't have it. Frierdiker Rebbe continues and says, I'm asking you to make an investigation about other soferim b'chlal in Montreal. Tell me about the Yirei Shamayim. Give me samples of their ksav. Send it to me. Let me know if there's any experts that are knowledgeable in making good klaf for a Sefer Torah. And this is an interesting correspondence that the Frierdiker Rebbe is having with Rabbi Greenglass at this time. Why is the Frierdiker Rebbe asking these questions in Tafshin Beis? What is going on in Cheshvan of Tafshin Beis that the Frierdiker Rebbe needs stam, and we also can tell he needs a Sefer Torah? And why is he interested in the ksav of the Alter Rebbe? So he says, generally we need it, but why specifically? What prompted this question right now? So I can't say we know 100%, but I think it's a very reasonable thing to suggest that we're dealing here with what's known as the Sefer Torah Shel Mashiach. On Simchas Torah of Tafshin Beis, a few weeks before the Frierdiker Rebbe wrote these letters to Rabbi Greenglass, the Frierdiker Rebbe announced that he is writing a special Sefer Torah with which we are going to greet Mashiach Tzidkeinu. And this Torah indeed was written in the early 1940s or over the mid-1940s. I believe it was completed sometime in 1948. The official siyum, as we know, didn't happen then. It was delayed all the way to 1970 to Yud Shvat Tafshin Lamed when the official siyum happened. It is mamish at the time when the Frierdiker Rebbe made this announcement, and when he's asking Rabbi Gringlas about the ksav of the Alter Rebbe. I think it's fair, even though we can't say 100%, I think it's fair to say the Frierdiker Rebbe was interested in that this Sefer Torah should be written in the ksav of the Tmuna HaMiyuchedes La'admar Azake. But Paul, that's not what happened. We have the contract that was written, it's signed by the Rebbe, Rabbi Simpson, and a Sofer. The Sofer's name is Yisrael Chaim Samet, whose name is signed at the bottom over here. This contract was written up in the Rebbe's handwriting, and basically it has all the contract between the Sofer and Lubavitch headquarters about the writing of the Sefer Torah. And one of the lines here, it says, Al Dvar HaSefer Torah shal Kabbalas Pei Mashiach Sidkenu shekibel al atzmai lichtov im kol ha'idurim sheyodu aloi al pi Kabbalas ha'arizal. You're going to write the Sefer Torah according to all of the Idurim based on the Kabbalah of the Arizal. There's no mention over here that the Sefer Torah is going to be written in the Tmuna HaMiyuchedes, in the ksav of the Alter Rebbe, and that's indeed what happened. The Sefer Torah Shal Mashiach was not written in accordance with this ksav, which really bespeaks about the fact that there was a disruption. There was a disruption. Tzemach Tzedek was talking about Stam Shalanu as a given in the 1820s, but when we come to the 1940s in America, apparently we don't have, in the 1940s, safrim who are expert in this type of writing. The result is the Sefer Torah Shal Mashiach is written in the ksav of the Arizal. However, now we want to fast forward even further, to talk about the reclamation of the ksav of the Alter Rebbe, and that's going to bring us to the year 1979. In 1979, in the Koivitz of Yagdol Torah, which was published here in Crown Heights, Tishrei Cheshvan Tov Shalom Etes, this is the first time that I know of where someone actually documented and wrote, removing this ksav Admar Azakin from a complete oral tradition and making it into a publicly available, documented something that's a piece of material that someone could learn. So he was a young rabbi at the time, Rabbi Yosef Simcha Ginsburg of Eretz Yisrael, and he publishes the following image. The following image is an image of Tefillin, and he's going to tell us that this image of Tefillin is a very, very important image of Tefillin. We'll see why in a second. This is the picture of the way it appeared in Yagdol Torah. You can see they took out Hashem's name, so that shouldn't be printed. The Shem Havaya was removed. But otherwise, you have over here the 4 parshiyos of Tefillin. Here's a much nicer and more updated picture of the same ksav, a beautiful ksav of Tefillin. What's the story of this ksav? And why is Rabbi Ginsburg publishing this ksav in 1979 in Yagdol Torah? The reason is because these tefillin belong to Rabbi Zalman Gurary. And as it relates in the biography, B'chol Beisi Nemanhu, they write over here that these are tefillin that he received from his father. His father's name was Reb Nosson Gurary. And his father, Reb Nosson Gurary, received these when he was in Russia. Reb Nosson passed away in Rostov. And the tradition was, when he bought these tefillin, that these tefillin were written by none other than Reuven of Yanovich himself. The Sofer that we spoke about before was the one who wrote these tefillin. This is not a surprising thing. Let's guess and say the purchase happened around the year 1900, which is good, let's say 80 years or so, or 70 years, I don't know exactly when Reuven passed away, but it's a good while after he passed away. It's not surprising at all that these were still on the market, because we have testimony to this effect from the Beis Rebbe. The Beis Rebbe was a sefer printed in 1902 by Rabbi Chaim Meir Halman. He was a chassid of Chabad Kapust. And he writes about the Talmidim of the Alter Rebbe, and among them he writes about Reb Reuven of Yanovich. And he says he's koises stam b'kedusha v'tara, and he was a chassid gadol and Yerei Shamayim gadol, and he's well known mefursam ba'olam b'stam shaloi. And then he writes uche'eis hatfilin shaloi, his tefillin today. Again, the book is printed in 1902. Yekarei hamitzias v'yekarei ha'erech. These are very valuable items. U'mishalmim avuram kol hoin. People pay top dollar to get his tefillin. And Reb Nosson Gurary was a gvir. It makes a lot of sense that Reb Nosson Gurary was one of the people who was interested in Reb Reuven's tefillin, and he ultimately it goes over B'Yerusha to Reb Zalman Gurary, who brings them over to the United States, and the Parshias are printed for the first time in these images in 1979. And all of a sudden now, if someone wants to know what the ksav of Reb Reuven is, the ksav of the Alter Rebbe, they're able to look, they're able to observe. This is what they wrote. Because there's an important caveat here, or I shouldn't say an important caveat, there is a caveat here. This is what they wrote. The images, they're from the Parshas of Tefillin Shal Yad that are by Rabbi Zalman Gurary. And they're Becheska Safik that they were authored, that they were written by Reb Reuven. Why is it Becheska Safik? Why is there some doubt? So, because Reb Zalman Gurary says, I gave these to the Rebbe, who gave them over to the Frierdiker Rebbe. The exact date of when this happened isn't clear, but sometime in the 1940s. And after the Frierdiker Rebbe saw them, he said that he is in doubt whether they are indeed from Reb Reuven, because it could be they're from his student, because his student wrote exactly like him. That's why I said it's a caveat, but it may not be such an important caveat. His student wrote exactly like him. If his student wrote exactly like him, it means he received all of the important information. But the Frierdiker Rebbe went on to say, so why am I questioning whether it was Reb Reuven? Because I have a shaila about the ink. Because his student was not able to write the ink in the same way. Elsewhere, the Frierdiker Rebbe gives the name of the student as Reb Zundel. His student was not able to do the ink in the same way that Reb Reuven was. And apparently, the Frierdiker Rebbe saw something here about the ink that made him question, maybe it's not from Reb Reuven, maybe it's from Reb Zundel. Okay, but still, we have something very significant here. So, in this article in Yagdal Torah, they went on to now give a model of what these letters are supposed to look at. These were written by a sofer who lives in Eretz Yisrael. His name is Reb Shimshon Kana. And he produced these letters. He said, this is based on these Parshias of Tefillin. This is what these letters are supposed to look like. And obviously, the objective over here was for people to start using this ksav more and for people to be more familiar about it, etc., etc. This is all in 1979. As a result of this, in the issues that followed, Rabbi Zirkin, we'll talk more about him soon, wrote some ha'aris and comments about his perspective on this matter, and Rabbi Mendel Arana from Toronto, we'll speak about him more in the future, in a few minutes, also wrote in, and so this really generated a conversation about ksav Admar HaZaken that I think was unparalleled in previous years. But before we get carried away with that, let's fast forward now another 20 years, and now we're in the year 1999. And now Rabbi Yosef Simcha Ginsburg comes for round 2. In the booklet Iskashrus that came out for Shabbos Parshas Yisroi in Shvat of Tavshin und Tes, he puts out another article called Ksav Stam Shal Admar HaZaken. He writes more information about it. Some of the things he says here we'll touch on later, including a new chart labeled Tmunas Ha'osis Shal Ksav Admar HaZaken. Maybe it's a little updated over the one from 20 years ago. I'm not the expert to be able to tell. And this article that he writes in 1999 is the one that sparks the controversy in words. There may have been a controversy among people orally prior, but there's no written record of it. But it's turned into a very wide-ranging debate in Lubavitch that was documented and written over the course of 1999 for the good next 5-6 years. This went on in various places. So now let's talk about the descent. And as you can see, when we start talking about the descent, this is going to force us to go back earlier to some of the tkufas that we glossed over earlier and to talk about some of those eras and some of the data from there as well. All right, so the captain of the descent is known by Rabbi Tuvia Zilberstrom from Yerushalayim. And he wrote in the Ha'aris U'Biurim of Ali Torah right after Rabbi Ginsburg published his piece in Iskashrus in 1999. Rabbi Zilberstrom published his piece in Ha'aris U'Biurim, and he begins his article writing, Vani lo zochisi lahavin es toichem ha'amarei. I don't understand what you're writing, Rabbi Ginsburg. Uve'ikra maskanasai. I don't understand your conclusion. Or another way of saying this is when someone says I don't understand, very often they mean I disagree. That's what he means. He means over here I disagree. Why does he disagree? For multiple reasons. Number one, he cites letters of the Rebbe. And so now we're going to go back to the 1950s and we're going to look at a series of letters from the Rebbe. This one is dated Chaf Tes Tevis Tafshin Yodalid. It is written to Rabbi Greenglass. The Rebbe writes as follows. about the oisius, about the drawing of the letters, that the Sofer Reb Yaakov Zilberman, who lives in Montreal, he sent to me. So apparently, it's not entirely clear, apparently the Rebbe asked Rabbi Greenglass to ask Reb Yaakov Zilberman, who is a well-known Sofer in Montreal, that he should write to him, do the research, and write to him how the Alter Rebbe's letters are supposed to look. Reb Yaakov Zilberman was not a Lubavitcher Chassid, and was not raised with ksav ad marazake. So this request, by definition, meant that he needed to do research in order to come up with this information. So now the Rebbe, apparently he did this, so the Rebbe is saying, about which he sent to me, he's like, as far as I can tell from the information that I'm getting from you, it looks like Rabbi Zilberman doesn't have a tradition, a Kabbalah ish mi pi ish. He doesn't have a Kabbalah ish mi pi ish about how to write ksav ad marazake. He's looking at parshas. As a sofer, he comes across different parshas. So he looked at parshas, which he understood to be ksav ad marazake, and based on that, he wrote to me a chart of what the letters are supposed to look at. Says the Rebbe, l'ch'oira, apparently, binyanin k'mayelu, when it comes to these matters, sarach lishmaya ish mi pi ish, you have to know one sofer at the ear from another sofer at the ear from another sofer. Why? Why is this important? Why is it important to have a tradition? Because you need to hear ma bedafka or ma ba bezdame, aval einoi bedafka. Because what happens is, if you open a parsha from a sofer and you start copying exactly what that sofer was doing, so let's say there are 6 anomalies, so you're going to copy all 6. It could be 4 of them were intentional and 2 of them were unintentional. In an extreme case, 1 could even be a mistake. 1 could even be a flaw. So you can't just say, I'm going to open, I'm going to copy. You also need to have like a sheet of the rules of this is what you're supposed to do. And then together with the image that you're looking at, then you can come up with something. But if you only are basing it off the image, then you don't know what's bedafka and what's bizdami, what happens to be happenstance, random. And so therefore the Rebbe says, so I'm asking. See, you see what the Rebbe is doing? The Rebbe is basically starting a research project. He's looking for people who have this type of Mesorah, what we're going to call, in tonight's shir, we're going to call the gold standard of a Mesorah. The gold standard of a Mesorah is that you not only learned from an expert, so from B'derech Klal, they learn from an expert. The gold standard is that you learn from an expert who actually told you the Alter Rebbe's ksav is A, B, C, D, E, F. And he also taught you the generalities of safrus. Okay, so this is a letter of the Rebbe to Rabbi Greenglass in Teves Tafshin Yud Daled, end of 53, beginning of 1954. Now the Rebbe writes to Rabbi Zilberman in Montreal directly. I received your letter, which has in the letter you have the chart of the oisius according to the Alter Rebbe, and it compares it to how others do this. And it seems from your letter that this is not a Kabbalah ish mi pi ish, but rather you're figuring it out, you're analyzing it from parshios that were written al yedei Sofrei Chabad. In other words, in Montreal you have safrus that was written. People had stam that was from Europe, and it was written by Sofrei Chabad, and that's how Rabbi Zilberman recreated what this is supposed to be. Says the Rebbe, we don't know what is exact and intentional and what is random. And so therefore, maybe as a mumcha, you should continue doing investigations, finding out if you is a way, maybe some way you could find the Kabbalah ish mi pi ish about what are the rules and regulations about these letters. This is Shvat of Tafshin Yudal. A year later, in Tevis of Tafshin Tesvav, the Rebbe writes to Rabbi Zevin. And the Rebbe writes to Rabbi Zevin, look at this following language. Hinei zeh chadoshim, it's many months that I'm trying to be mevar the Mesorahs of Ksiva by Sofrei Anash for Tefillin and for a Sefer Torah. Uleis ata, as of now, loyhe leisi margolus biyadi, I have not been successful. I've not found a jewel. Ki ein yediyas buruz, there isn't clear information. Maybe in Eretz Yisrael, there's someone that knows. He writes to Rabbi Zevin. Maybe you could find that in Eretz Yisrael. Then the Rebbe introduces a very interesting caveat. The truth is, I'm not so sure how much I want to rely on Eretz Yisrael, because in the past experience, they write to me about the certain minhagim and hanagas that they have, and I know for sure it's exactly the opposite of what the Frierdiker Rebbe told me. So I'm not so sure that we could b'chlal rely on the Messiah in Eretz Yisrael, but nonetheless, it can't hurt, so please ask around and maybe see. This is what the Rebbe writes to Rabbi Zevin. And finally, the last of this batch is a letter from Tafshin Yud Zayin, Tishrei Tafshin Yud Zayin. So remember, this story started in Tafshin Yud Daled. Now we're already in Tafshin Yud Zayin, a letter to Rabbi Chaim Meir Gurary. He's famous as being the father of Rebbe Gershon Mendel Gurary. Anyway, the Rebbe writes, "It's Anyan Ladas. I'd like to know in Yedei Borur Tzuras Oisius Hanog Ben Chasidei Chabad. Do you clearly know how the letters are supposed to be? That's customary by Chabad. Al Pi Rabbeinu Azaken V'im Kain. And if you do, Mimi Kibel Maserazu. Who do you receive this tradition from? And also tell me V'Asamchus Shalzeh Shamazur Alzeh. Tell me about the reliability of this person." So clearly, the Rebbe was very interested in determining what the ksav of the Alter Rebbe was. And it appears based on these pieces, at least in one of them, the Rebbe says, I haven't been successful. Says Rabbi Zilberstrom in 1999, well, apparently this ksav of the Alter Rebbe is gone. The Rebbe was looking for it, and the Rebbe was not willing to rely on anything. The Rebbe was not willing to rely on recreating it. You put Reb Reuven Sofer's Tefillin in Yagdal Torah? What does that do? The Rebbe clearly negated that approach, he says. The Rebbe was saying, I need not only to look at a parsha, because then I don't know what's legitimate and what's random. Says Rabbi Zilberstrom, this proves that the Rebbe did not want to rely on the ksav that we have in front of us, because you don't know what exactly is there and intentional and what's, and especially he mentioned the fact there are some people who looked at the ksav Chabad and they said, I don't know if this is so good, right? People, not Lubavitchers, ask questions about it. So he says, once you have that, and you don't have a real Messiah, so I don't know, I think that Rebbe wouldn't want us to go with this, he goes on to say. So this is reason number one. Rabbi Zilberstrom was against, and is still against, the using of the Alter Rebbe's ksav. He then goes on to bring another argument. He says, in New York, there is in the library of Gudas Chabad, there is a Alter Rebbe's, a Megilah written by the Rebbe Maharash. And he says, look, this Megilah of the Rebbe Maharash, the Rebbe, when he talked about it, and he said, oh, look, like, there's information here for the public, what did he say? Two things. Number one, that not every column begins with HaMelech. As you can see here, here's a picture of this Megilah. Not every column begins with HaMelech. And the Aseres B'nai Haman are not written on a single column, they're only written at the top of a column. B'chlal, you should mention, there aren't high-res images of this entire Megilah that's ever been made public. It's one of the many secrets that still remain in the library. We spoke about this in the past, about other matters, but anyway, but here is a decent picture of it. And so says Rabbi Zilberstrom, the Rebbe only pointed to the HaMelech factor, and only pointed to the names of Haman factor, but didn't do something. What didn't he do? Didn't say, hey, let's have a look at the letters. Rebbe Maharash obviously was going to write, but Stam Shalonu was obviously going to write the ksav Alter Rebbe. And yet, he didn't do that. The Rebbe didn't do that. What does that prove, says Rabbi Zilberstrom? I didn't say my opinion, by the way, I hope that's clear. But what does that prove, says Rabbi Zilberstrom? Rabbi Zilberstrom says, because it's not reliable. You can't rely on this because we don't do that. You can't just pull out a ksav and look at it. The Rebbe canceled this idea of taking a ksav and looking at it. In follow-up pieces, he in fact went even further. And this is going to get us a little into the nitty-gritty. But he said, if you look with the images that are available to us, if you look at the nun in this Megilah of the Rebbe Maharash, you're going to see a problem. What's the problem? The problem is we spent so much time earlier that in the Alter Rebbe's ksav, unlike the Shulchan Aruch, he says, in the Shulchan Aruch he said, what? The nun looks like a Zion. The roof spills over to the right and to the left. However, in Stam Shalanu, the Samach Tzedek said, we're not doing that. It looks more like a Vav, like this. It doesn't have a wide roof to the right. This is the nun that the Samach Tzedek endorsed. And look at the word Dinas, where there's a nun, and that looks much closer to a Zion. There's much more chomer over there pouring out from the right-hand side than you have over here. So all of a sudden, now this is getting really blurry and confusing. Now we don't know what's going on, because look in this Megilah that Rebbe Maharash, it's not consistent with what his own thing the father says. This only endorses the fact that we have no clue, and so therefore this is unreliable. So that's reason number 2, bringing in the Rebbe Maharash's Megilah, why Rabbi Zilberstrom says we should not be following or using the Alter Rebbe's ksav. He said many other things, and we're not going to have the chance to talk about everything. But one of the things he wrote, and he wrote this in public, he says that I heard in the name of Rabbi Matlin. I heard. Now, a lot of people have said things in the name of Rabbi Matlin. He says, I heard in the name of Rabbi Matlin. Rabbi Matlin had passed away a few years before. He passed away in Tafshin Nun Vav. This is Tafshin Nun Tes. That the Rebbe's Tefillin was written in the ksav of the Arizal. Wow, that's a clincher. The Rebbe's Tefillin, according to him, he says, I heard in the name of Rabbi Matlin, the Rebbe's Tefillin is written in the ksav of the Arizal. I didn't spend so much time earlier focusing on the fact that the Arizal introduced a few modifications to what's known as the ksav of Beis Yosef, and that's in the Welt called the ksav of the Arizal. The Alter Rebbe incorporated a number of those ideas, but as we already know, it's not fully consistent with what's known in the Welt as ksav of the Arizal. He's saying over here that Rebbe used what's known in the Welt today as ksav ha-Arizal. He goes further. He quotes the following letter from Tafshin Gimel, Kislev Tafshin Gimel, the Frierdiker Rebbe, writing to Rabbi Eliezerov in Eretz Yisrael. The Frierdiker Rebbe is looking, he says, I already sent you in a telegram that I'm looking for Rabbeinu Tam. And they shouldn't be too big, they shouldn't be too small. Now I'm asking for Rashi, Rabbeinu Tam, Shimush Rabbah, Ravid. Okay, he's asking for other pairs of tefillin over here. And he says, but these should be very small, but meet the Ktana b'yoser. He's also saying, I'm interested in information about a Sefer Torah as well. So says Rabbi Zilberstrom, if you're asking in Eretz Yisrael in 1943 for tefillin, you're only going to get the Arizal's ksav. There was no one in Eretz Yisrael that was writing the Alter Rebbe's ksav in 1943. They even go further, and I didn't spend too much time looking into this, where they say they know who the Sofer was. It was Rabbi Yehuda Asher Rat, and they know for sure Yehuda Asher Rat only wrote in ksav of the Arizal. And he now makes another suggestion. He says, obviously, who's the Frierdiker Rebbe looking for? He's looking either for himself or for someone else in Beis Harav. And so that really tells us about the prominence of ksav Arizal, and this is another reason why this is something we should be taking. He goes further, and he says that I heard, and Bechlal, you should know in this sugya, there's a lot of I heards, which is one of the challenges in this sugya. He says, I heard that the Rebbe once asked someone for mezuzahs, and he said that, do you write the Alter Rebbe? He said no. And the Rebbe said, okay, you write Arizal, give it to me in ksav Arizal. So here you see again, the Rebbe is using ksav Arizal. And then he goes and says, we all know the Rebbe was looking for a Mesorah. We didn't get the Mesorah. And he says, this is B'pashtus, the reason why the Frierdiker Rebbe and the Rebbe didn't wear tefillin of the Alter Rebbe, but of the Arizal. This is what he concludes this piece with. Okay, this is Rabbi Zilberstrom writing. Okay, how does he know? That's the good question. 1 second, we're going to talk about that. We're going to get there. Okay, now, one other piece. He then says, I investigated. This is a few years later, he writes. I'm putting all his different pieces of writing, I'm putting together. He says, I investigated. I spoke to all of the safrim. No one has told me that they received the Oirah from the Rebbe to write in ksav ad marazak. And this is another claim he makes. We'll address all of his claims soon. Okay, now he has one of his allies is Rabbi Yisachar David Kloisner in Eretz Yisrael, and he basically has over here, he wrote a Maisa, and as you're going to see, it's going to be, I heard from one person, I heard from another person, but at least here you have a trail. So the trail goes like this. There's a man by the name of Yaakov Habib in France. He says that he was in Berwan in 1988. He wanted tefillin. He spoke to Reb Aaron Yosef Bilenitsky, who told him that you should get the Arizal, because when Reb Nissen many years earlier was in New York and he asked the Rebbe about what type of mezuzahs he should order, the Rebbe told Reb Nissen that he should order ksav Arizal because there's many shilas, or there's a number of shilas about ksav ad marazake. So that the chain is Reb Nissen, Aaron Yosef Bilenitsky. How does Rabbi Belinitzky, no, I'm not entirely sure, but he's saying in the name of Reb Nissen, and then Rabbi Chabib is repeating this, and so Rabbi Kleusner puts this into the mix, and Rabbi Kleusner is one of Rabbi Zilberstrom's allies in this battle against the use of the ksav Admar Zaken. Both of them have spent a lot of time writing about this at great length. Okay, so I showed you their side of the story, and now let's start dealing with the response. Our response is going to begin with none other than Rabbi Eliezer Tzvi Zirkint, the legendary sofer here in Crown Heights. He was not too happy about Rabbi Zilberstrom's article in 1999. And he immediately responded in the same platform of the Haras Ubiurim of Oli Torah. He says, I have a question. Megilah zois libni. You said you're right that the Rebbe and the Frierdiker Rebbe didn't wear tefillin of the Alter Rebbe, but only wore the Arizal. Who told you this? First of all, about the Frierdiker Rebbe, I have an image of the Frierdiker Rebbe's tefillin that I received from Rabbi Shaya Matlin, and it's the Alter Rebbe's ksav, number one. And about the Rebbe, who saw them? There's only two people who saw the inside of the Rebbe's tefillin, Rabbi Shaya Matlin, and he never told anyone what was inside. And the second person, Rabbi Zirkin doesn't say clearly, but we know, is me, and I also never told anyone. So how could you come out in public and say that the Rebbe wore ksav Arizal and that the Frierdiker Rebbe, this isn't true? Here's an image of the Frierdiker Rebbe's tefillin that Rabbi Zirkin possessed, which is in the ksav of the Alter Rebbe. What about the fact that the Frierdiker Rebbe was ordering tefillin where a good argument could be made that it was ksav Arizal in the 1940s? So there's a few things about this. Number one, we have to remember who says it was for the Frierdiker Rebbe himself. We don't know. It's not entirely clear. A good argument can be made it was because this Ravid Shimush Rabbah, how many Yidden in America were putting those on? So we don't know. There's no evidence that it was actually for the Frierdiker Rebbe. But even if it was, even if it were, let's also remember, this is during the period when we established before, you don't have really ksav Admar Hazaken. It's not something that's available in the 1940s. So to build a whole building on a period when there isn't availability is obviously a difficult thing to do. There's another factor to consider over here. That is, the Rebbe writes in his Rishimis that both the Rebbe Maharash and the Rebbe Rashab had a custom, at least for a while, to do the chumrah of putting on the multiple pairs of tefillin at the same time. And if you want to do that and you want to do it right, it needs to be small tefillin. So it is very possible, again, everything is speculation, but it is possible when the Frierdiker Rebbe is ordering this small tefillin in 1943, it's not his primary period tefillin, but a secondary period tefillin to follow this chumrah that his father and grandfather had observed for a period of time, as related in the Rishimis and Tafrei Tzaddik Aleph. Once it's not a primary period tefillin, so all of a sudden the necessity, so to speak, goes down a little less, and maybe it's not the end of the world if it's not the Alter Rebbe's ksav. Let's continue. Rabbi Zirkin now addresses another issue, and that is it acceptable to look at a ksav and make determinations based on observation? So Rabbi Zilberstrom was quoting all those letters of the Rebbe, and he was arguing, no, you're not allowed to look, never look, only if you have a direct Messiah of rules. Which, by the way, kind of welcome to ask, what about the other ksav? This is a standard people want to impose on the Alter Rebbe. Do we have that for the ksav of the Arizal? And do we have that for the ksav of the Beis Yosef? But anyway, says Rabbi Zirkin over here, he says this is incorrect. Why is it incorrect? Because of the tshuva of the Samach Tzedek we saw before. We saw that the Samach Tzedek said, B'stam shalanu, it's done in a certain way. In other words, the Samach Tzedek is working based on observation. You're allowed to work on observation. What's the Rebbe doing over here? Why is the Rebbe saying, I want something else? So Rabbi Zirkin and others explained. Rabbi Monshein wrote about this a lot during this period as well. There is no doubt that in the 1950s, the Rebbe was looking for the gold standard of a Messiah. And the gold standard of a Messiah is obviously not looking at a parsha and making determinations based on that. The gold standard of a Messiah is when you have not only Ish Mi Pi'ish, a Messiah Ish Mi Pi'ish. That's also not enough. Every sefer was taught by someone. No. The Messiah which comes along, which says, this is the thing. These are the things you need to look at. This is the Alter Rebbe's ksav. That's the gold standard. Was the Rebbe looking for that in the 1950s? There's no doubt that the Rebbe was looking for that in the 1950s. Does that in and of itself mean, and if you don't have that, so therefore the whole thing is out? Where does it say that? Where does it say that? No one said that. It means you have another standard. What's the other standard? The other standard is, which other poskim say you're allowed to do, and the Tzemach Tzedek saying you're allowed to do, is you open it up and you look. Very simple. Now, so does it mean that Rebbe shouldn't ask for the higher? Of course the Rebbe wanted the higher standard. Of course the Rebbe wanted it. And by the way, it's a very fair question to ask. Did that level, that gold standard, did it exist in Doira Chamishi? Lav Davka? Sofrim were writing, did they hamamish have it in that way? Did it exist in the times of the Rebbe Maharash? Also Lav Davka. Lav Davka, each one of we spoke about the Talmud. Reb Zundel, when Reb Reuven taught Reb Zundel, did he teach him this is how you do it? Or did he also give the list and saying, these are the things that are my style, and these are the unique things from the Alter Rebbe? We don't know. We're not in the room. We have no clue. So we don't know if that Messiah ever existed. But the Rebbe wanted to know if that Messiah existed. But does that in and of itself mean, or another way of saying it, did the Rebbe ever say, or did anyone ever say that absent that, so therefore we don't have the right to recreate it? How could you do that? Rabbi Zirkin, during this period of time, gave an interview in the Kfar Chabad magazine. This is ER of 2002. There's a number of points that he conveyed in this interview. Number one, Rabbi Zobasham said, the Rebbe never told anyone to do ksav ad marazakin. Rabbi Zirkin said, the Rebbe told him that he should learn the ksav of the Alter Rebbe. Number one. How did he learn it? He says he learned it from a Megilah of the Rebbe Maharash. We're going to talk about that more in a moment. He says, you spoke about there's a nun problem? There's no nun problem, Rabbi Zirkin said. And we'll talk about that more in a moment. He says the Frierdiker Rebbe's Tefillin were Chabad, ksav Chabad. I showed that to you before. So the interviewer asked him, what about the Rebbe's Tefillin? He says, I'm not answering that question. We don't answer that question. He says that the Rebbe ordered for David Chase Tefillin, and it was in ksav Chabad. He says the Rebbe ordered mezuzahs from me and from Rabbi Matlin that were in ksav Chabad. How do I know Rabbi Matlin's mezuzahs were ksav Chabad? Because I checked them. And I was able to tell it's the Alter Rebbe's ksav. Now, what's interesting over here, this itself caused the whole ruckus, because the Rabbi Zilberstrom and Rabbi Kloisner said, oh, one second, there's something fishy going on over here. Rabbi Zirkin is telling us about the Rebbe's mezuzahs, but he's not telling us about the Rebbe's tefillin. So, it must mean that he's not telling us about the Rebbe's tefillin. He's telling, when it's the Alter Rebbe's ksav, he tells us. So it must mean that the Rebbe's tefillin is ksav al arizal. Okay, there could be many other reasons why maybe the Rabbi Zirkin was told not to say anything about the Rebbe's tefillin. But I want to give you a little bit of a taste of the noise and the writing and the controversy and the debate that exists around this issue. So now let's talk about when Rabbi Zirkin says he learned ksav of the Alter Rebbe from the Rebbe Maharash's Megilah. So I asked, what does this mean? Because the Rebbe Maharash's Megilah, Rabbi Zilberstrom pointed out the problem that we spoke about before. So I asked, and here I should say, in preparation for the shir, I spoke to a number of safrim. So the information that I'm going to tell you right now came from Rabbi Yossi Oltein. Rabbi Yossi Oltein says that it is clear to him that when the Rabbi Zirkin says that he learned from the Rebbe Maharash's Megilah, he's not referring to the Megilah in the library. Why is that? Because the library and its contents for most of the years, and definitely in the 50s and 60s, were off limits, and he doesn't think that Rabbi Zirkin would have had access to the Megilah. Instead, which Megilah was Rabbi Zirkin working off of was another Megilah attributed to the Rebbe Maharash that is written in the Alter Rebbe's ksav. Today there are very nice pictures available due to Rabbi Fitzrabin, who took these images. The story of this Megilah is as follows. The Rebbe Maharash, the tradition is that he wrote 3 Megillahs, one for each of his sons. This belonged to Reb Menachem Mendel. This Reb Menachem Mendel gave it to Reb Zalman Schneerson in Paris. Reb Zalman Schneerson gave it to Reb Elia Chaim Carlebach, and Ad Hayoim, it's in the Carlebach family's possession. What's interesting about this Megilah, by the way, is you can probably tell, each column actually does begin with Hamelech. Hamelech, Hamelech. But the sons of Haman are written, again, only at the top of the column, not written in the entire column. So Rabbi Yossi Oltein says that it's pretty clear to him that when Rabbi Zirkin says he learned from the Rebbe Maharash's Megilah, he was learning from this Megilah. And here, all these nuns are exactly the way that Tzemach Tzedek said, and exactly the way it is in Reb Reuven's Parshias. It's not the Zion version of the nun, but the Vav version of the nun. Okay. What about the Rebbe Maharash's Megilah in the library itself, though? Because, as we saw before, Rabbi Zirkin said that we have this problem. The problem is, not Rabbi Zirkin, Rabbi Zobashram said, look at this nun over here, it looks like a Zayin, so here we have this problem. So it was pointed out by Rabbi Munshine and others, it's actually not consistent. If you go to this nun and the word Medina, you'll actually see that it's not a Zayin. It's much closer to a Vav. It's what the Tzemach Tzedek was speaking about. If you go here to the word Bishnas, this one's borderline, but I think it's closer to a Vav than it is to a Zayin. Okay, so that only now raises the question, what's going on over here? Why do we have inconsistency in this Megilah of the Rebbe Maharash? There are many safrim who will tell you that despite the lack of great pictures for this Megilah that's in the library, when they look at it, they're able to tell that it's a doctored Megilah. They're able to tell, because of the expertise that they have, that this Megilah was touched up by somebody. Just before I continue, I want to mention that I mentioned two safrim that I spoke to in preparation for this year. I spoke to Rabbi Fitz Rabin, who was a great help, and I spoke to Rabbi Yossi Oltein, who was a tremendous help. I want to mention two other safrim that I spoke to. One is Rabbi Yehuda Klapman, who happens to be here in the audience, though he takes no achrayus whatsoever for anything that I say, and his presence here by no means implies that he consents to what I'm saying. That's the first thing. But I do thank him very much for his time. And Rabbi Levi Patash from Northern California, also tremendous amount of time and effort where he was able to help me in this area that requires tremendous expertise. But anyway, so back to our problem. So our problem is, what are we going to do with this Megilah that Rebbe Maharash in the library, where we have inconsistencies? So I mentioned that some of the safrim, and a number of the safrim I spoke to, said that this is something that is evident to them by the pictures that they're looking at. And in one of the safrim told me that Rabbi Zirkin told him the following story. Rabbi Oltein says, in the name of Rabbi Zirkin, that there was a sofer here in Crown Heights in the 1940s. His name was Rabbi Shmaryo Paktor. He in fact was involved in Mashiach Sefer Torah. He's not the one who started it. That was Rabbi Samet, we saw before the contract, but he's the one who made the siyum in Tafshan Lamed. He's the one who made the siyum. And he was not familiar with the ksav of the Alter Rebbe, according to the story. The Frierdiker Rebbe gave him the Megilah of the Rebbe Maharash because it needed some repair in the 1940s. And he did a comprehensive change to the Megilah, updating it in ways that he thought was appropriate, but thereby he ended up doctoring the Megilah. The language I was told is up to 85% of it has been doctored. Of course, it is impossible for any of this to be confirmed without high-resolution images of this entire Megilah, which ad hayom don't exist, as we spoke about earlier. But anyway, that would explain the issues there. But again, you have to come back to this other point. Other point it is wrong to say that the nuns there are not the way the Tzemach Tzedek had it. The majority of the nuns that we can see are, and we have the whole Megilah, just not in good images. And it's enough for us to see that the nuns look like this, much more than they look like that. And so therefore, that's another response to Rabbi Zilberstrom's claim. However, perhaps the most important response to Rabbi Zilberstrom and co. is the following letters of the Rebbe that Rabbi Zirkin quoted in his articles, and Rabbi Munshine quoted in his articles on this topic as well. The Rebbe writes a letter in Tafshin Yud Beis to Rabbi Aronov and says that I have this plan that you're going to write mezuzahs for Merkez and Yonei Chinuch. And the Rebbe adds, "Was mistame schreibt leiter deya von Admar Azak." I assume you're writing according to the Alter Rebbe. So here you see, the Rebbe is interested in the Alter Rebbe's ksav. And indeed, Rabbi Aronov, all of the years of his safrus, that's how he was trained, and that's what he wrote. Now, if you wanted, and some of them said, well, no, the meaning over here is Alter Rebbe in the Shulchan Aruch. Only the Alter Rebbe in the Shulchan Aruch. Well, there's a lot of problems by suggesting that, but the main problem is it doesn't work with the other letters either. And also, it's not how Rabbi Aronov writes, or wrote. There's a letter, another letter, Dalar El Tovshin Tezvav, about the Tmunas HaOisius that is Benoyeg Shebechabad. So indeed, you're right, the Rebbe tells us individuals named Chaim. Kama Shinuyim Yeshnam, there are differences between what Chabad does and what the Alter Rebbe has in his Shulchan Aruch. But we're used to that in Lubavitch. We have the Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch, and then we have a Siddur, it's a later version of the Alter Rebbe's teachings, and we follow a Siddur. So we're used to this idea of not everything that's in the Shulchan Aruch is something that we are actually keeping. He goes on to say, these are learned orally. It's not coming from the Shulchan Aruch. It's Dvarim hal nomadim mipel peh misofer lesofer, and I can't explain this to you, or probably no one could explain it to you b'ksav. And so therefore, you want information about the Alter Rebbe's ksav? Speak to a sofer stam who does minik Chabad. Here you see, contrary to the theory that Alter Rebbe's ksav is something that's dead and needs to be buried, the Rebbe, in the same tkufa, when he's doing his investigation, the same tkufa when he's asking, he's saying, Lo hela margolus biyadi, and I didn't find it. At the same time, he's writing, Noyek Chabad exists, and it's not what it says in Shulchan Aruch, and if you want to learn it, speak to Chabad Sofer. Next letter, Tafshin Yud Zayin. You're asking about the Tefillin and the parshas of Anash and Chassidei Chabad. Definitely you'll find in Eretz Yisrael, Soifrim who know the Tmunas Oisis Al Piyam HaSeirem Rabbeinu Azak. Again, the Rebbe is talking about this as a living and breathing thing that people do. Here is perhaps the most famous of these letters. Someone writes to the Rebbe that he comes from a Chabad family and he's about to prepare, he's about to order parshas. But he's not sure. Why is he not sure? Because he believes that God wants what the majority of Jews are doing. And because the majority of the Jews are not doing ksav ad marazoken, so it's not what Hashem wants, and so therefore he doesn't want to do it. The Rebbe writes, I'm shocked. Why? Because there's a rule, ba'asrei derav no karav, that in the community of a particular rabbi, you paskin like him. And the Metzias is over here, and obviously the Rebbe is teaching asrei metaphorically. You're a chassid Chabad, you come from Chabad family, so you're shaykh to Chabad. So of course you should go with the Alter Rebbe's ksav. He goes on to say, obviously the Alter Rebbe knew what all of Rov Klal Yisrael was doing, and nonetheless, the Alter Rebbe said, this is what Hashem wants, and this is what we need to do. This is Ratzei Be'enei HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And therefore he says, you should leave your derech of asking questions and looking for stiris and just go in the straight way of nasa before nishma. And that's what our Rebbeim wanted. And he says, just like we have a shar ha-koilo when it comes to nusach hari, and that's the Alter Rebbe's siddur, and I don't want to go too far into that, and it works for all Jews. It's a shar ha-koilo. Shar ha-koilo by definition means it works for all Jews. Their tefillis could ascend after through that. The Rebbe equates Alter Rebbe's ksav to that. It's also for all Jews. Rabbi Zirkin concluded, after quoting this letter, La'ayin nira, it appears to me, She'garas hasayis nichtav gam laharav tes zayin. This letter of the Rebbe, written in 1957, was also written to Rabbi Tuvia Zilbershon. This is what Rabbi Zirkin writes in the Ha'aris Ubiur. Okay. Now, if you look at what they write, they come up with explanations. Rabbi Kloisner wrote an essay in where he explains the letter like this. Because this individual attacked the theory of the Alter Rebbe's ksav, according to him, the Alter Rebbe should have never done it, because majority of Klal Yisrael. So therefore, the Rebbe felt that he had to defend it. So he defended the theory of the Alter Rebbe's ksav, or the origins of it. The fact that the Alter Rebbe created it, but it doesn't necessarily mean that we should use it. Okay, I ask you in the audiences, you think that's the pashut pshat of the Alter Rebbe's letter? I think that's a very big doichik to learn that pshat in this letter of the Rebbe. There are also oral reports. There's a sofer by the name of Reb Chaim Ozer Maranovsky. He had yichidus with the Rebbe. The Rebbe told him, "Aber ihr sollt lernen ksav Chabad." Okay, but what about the Rebbe's tefillin though? Do we know anything about the Rebbe's tefillin? Is it possible to know anything about the Rebbe's tefillin? Rabbi Zirkin says there's only two people who saw inside, and both of them don't say anything. So is it possible to say anything? So maybe a little something is possible to say, and Rabbi Manshan is the one who pointed the following out. If you go to your bookshelf and you pull out the Hatamim is a journal that was printed by Tenchet Tzmimim, by Lubavitch in Poland in the 1930s. And there's a lot of beautiful Torah there and a lot of important information over there, and that's why many homes we have these works. However, you do not have at home an exact facsimile of how this Hatamim appeared in the 1930s. And so here you have on the screen, you're looking now at the original release of the 7th Kovetz of In fact, if you look well, you'll see it says at the top right, Fagin. So presumably that's Reb Chacha Fagin's personal copy at a certain time. And in the back over here, there's his stamp. Okay, so the library here, there's about 10 or 15 copies of this version. At the back you have ads. This Moidah Rabbah, on all the ads that appear at the end, are not there in the facsimile edition that you have at home. You have over here a sofer by the name of Zalman Weinstein. It's a 2-page ad about his safrus. And he basically has letters of endorsement from various people about why you should buy his ksav. So on the top right, he writes like this: I learned in Lubavitch between the year Tafresh Ayin Beis 1912 at Tafresh Pei Av till 1921. I learned safrus in Lubavitch. We know there were sofrim training in Lubavitch. There are other sofrim we know who got their training in Lubavitch. And he says over here, when the Frierdiker Rebbe moved here, so he writes, V'gam kvajus amar shlita, the Frierdiker Rebbe, ksav esli parshiyos, he ordered by me parshiyos, avor chasanov v'nechtoi, for his sons-in-law and for his grandson, the Rashag's son. Okay, good. So now we have a sofer who's saying that he wrote for the sons-in-law. Presumably it includes the Rebbe. It would be, of course, could always say it doesn't include the Rebbe, but presumably it includes the Rebbe. Now, what ksav did he write it? What ksav did Reb Zalman Weinstein write it? So he actually doesn't tell you. He just says, I'm a sofer, I'm good, and you should use me, and I have a whole bunch of letters of endorsement. But one of the letters is from Chacha Fagin, on the top left. And it says over there that he says, I sent Zalman Weinstein's parshiyas, I sent them to Yeshaya Gittels, who is a sofer stam in another city here in Kivel, and tell me your opinion about it. And he wrote back and he said that ha-parshiyah sheshalachti hu aksav ha-mekubal etzel anash me'admer hazokin. V'gam hu ksav mehuder b'li shum pikbuk. The parshiyas that you sent me from Zalman Weinstein is the ksav, that is the ksav that we have tradition. This is what this sofer Yeshaya Gittels is writing in 1935. This is the ksav we have from the Alter Rebbe. This is Zalman Weinstein. So, do we know things about the Rebbe's Tefillin? We don't know much. But if you want one piece of data, a very reasonable argument can be made based on this material here, that the Rebbe, at least in the 1930s, was wearing the Tefillin of ksav Admar Hazaken. And in fact, a recently released letter from 1938, where the Rebbe writes, the Frierdiker Rebbe writes to Rebbe Chaim Mushke and the Rebbe, they had just moved into a new house in Paris. The Rebbe writes, the Frierdiker Rebbe writes, tell me how many doors you have in your apartment that require a mezuzah, and I'm going to send you mezuzahs from who? From Atomim, Reb Zalman Sofer. This is Reb Zalman Weinstein. And we know that he writes ksav Admar Hazaken. So here you have it pretty clearly that at least these mezuzahs that the Rebbe had in Paris were ksav Yad Admar Hazaken. Now, there is still, if you read these articles, you'll see, I heard from someone who heard, and this lot, and most of my presentation, I hope I was being a good boy and not bring too much of that in. Okay, but I do want to say there's a lot of that out there, and then the big question becomes, how much does that become an ingredient that becomes a factor to guide a decision versus hard evidence and documents that we've been looking at today? So here's a summary of my takeaways from this sugya. Number one, yes, we do have letters where the Rebbe is looking for a certain standard. However, that standard doesn't negate the lower standard that we spoke about. Just because the Rebbe is looking for the high standard of ish mi pi ish, of what is exact, doesn't necessarily by definition mean that the lower standard of just looking at a ksav and doing reasonable work based off of that is off the table. And again, one needs to ask whether other traditions of safrus really do have an unchanging standard from generation to generation at that level. Okay, that's number one. Number two, another important point. All of those letters that we'll call the skeptical letters, where the Rebbe is doing his investigative work, none of them are written to a person saying, and therefore don't use it. They're all, the Rebbe engaged, it's something internal. so to speak. The Rebbe is engaged in his research project. It's not a directive to a person what he should or shouldn't be doing. That's a very important point. On the other hand, we do have letters where the Rebbe is writing to people what they should and shouldn't be doing that sound like they should be using ksav Chabad. Another point. There's aberrations in the Megilah, the Rebbe Maharash's Megilah in the library, but there is an explanation for why those aberrations exist. And in the other Megilah attributed to the Rebbe Maharash, it is very standard, ksav Alter Rebbe. It matches very well with Reuven Sofer. Of course, are there differences? The Sofrim will tell you, yes, there's minor differences, and the Lubavitcher Sofer in the last few decades have been working out all those minor variations, but there is so much in common between those two. The Frierdiker Rebbe's Tefillin, as we saw, were the Alter Rebbe's ksav. Maybe he had a second pair, but if he did, it came from what we're calling the dark era, when we know that there was no ksav Alter Rebbe. We saw in that letter to Rabbi Greenglass where it's like, Chaval, we need this here. It doesn't exist, which is why the Mashiach Sefer Torah B'Pashtus was written in that way. Again, spiritual reasons, you can always go further, spiritual reasons. If you want to go das balabatim, that's a very reasonable thing to say. In terms of the Rebbe, there is at least some evidence that the Rebbe, there's, I think, very clear evidence that the Rebbe's mezuzahs in Paris were the Alter Rebbe's ksav. There's pretty decent evidence that the Rebbe's Tefillin were also the Alter Rebbe's ksav. There are a lot of shmuas, but how much are we going to really base ourselves on shmuas that were one person said in the name of another person? That's kind of difficult. And finally, there are many written sources from the Alter Rebbe, not just rumors, to write the Alter Rebbe. And it's not one of the things Rabbi Zilberstrom and Rabbi Kloisner spoke about was maybe Alter Rebbe just meant like I don't know how you how you do the Seres B'nai Haman, put it at the top of the page, or other larger structural things that aren't about the letters themselves. But I think the evidence is pretty clear from the documents we saw before and the writings of the Rebbe that this is not the case. So we have many written sources, not just rumors, to write the Alter Rebbe's ksav. And I think the outcome of all this is as far as I can tell in America, the Alter Rebbe's ksav has more or less become the norm. It's more or less become the norm. There are some people who were a little skeptical about it in the 70s, but over the years, the skepticism, I think, has waned. This is just my observation. The reason I think Arizal, when you come to a Sofer today, they say, what do you want, Alter Rebbe or Arizal? I think the reason that's happening is mostly because of economics, and that the Arizal's ksav ends up being cheaper, which in a sense is a little unfortunate if that's the reason why this is happening. But at the same time, I think the voice of Rabbi Zilberstrom and co. plays a role in this. Because even if people don't agree with them, it's always something you can say, well, there's a debate about this, and so you know what, and it's $20 cheaper, or $50 or $100 cheaper, or in the case of Sefer Torah, thousands of dollars cheaper, so you know what, let's just go with that. So I think their voice, I think this is generally true. Radical positions, even if you don't agree with them, they have a down-the-line effect in ways that sometimes we don't realize. And I think their position, as much as people maybe don't want to agree with them, I think it has an effect that comes when you're standing there and it's cheaper and you just say, you know what, we're just going to go ahead and we're going to do that. Now, at the end of the day, the Mashiach Sefer Torah is written in Ksav Arizal, so no one is pushing that away. No one is rejecting that. But I would say that if someone, let's say, is investing money in a Sefer Torah and they're going to make a beautiful keser, and they're going to put a lot of money into the Asei Chaim, and they're going to make a beautiful Achnasa Sefer Torah, and they're going to invest money in all those areas, and then here, Dafka, we're not. So that sounds a little funny to me. That's my personal opinion. That sounds a little funny to me. Likewise, in other in other such areas. That's my takeaway on this subject. But of course, there's so many. But what I didn't finish is, but in Eretz Yisrael, I think the matzah is different. In Eretz Yisrael, the anti-ksav admar azaken voice is stronger, as you can see from some of the things we spoke about. And I think while it definitely exists, that voice is stronger, and there's more. I would say that percentage-wise, there's less Alter Rebbe and a little more ksav Arizal in the Chabad community. That's my maskana. Obviously, when it comes to halacha l'maisa, We know the most important thing is to contact your rabbi, your local Orthodox rabbi, and do as he directs you, assuming he has knowledge about this area. And if he doesn't, then he's supposed to direct you to another Rav who does have knowledge about this area. And may Hashem help that the mitzvahs that we do in Stam, Sifrei Torah, Mezuzahs, and Tefillin, that it should be nirtza lefanav, that he should have nachas ruach from us in the way that we do this mitzvah. And may God bless you all. Thank you for your attention and have a wonderful night.